ecology unit, we will go through species, communities, and ecosystems. What we talk about we'll cover through the various IB statements related to topic 4.1. So we'll start simply with the study of ecology. So the study of ecology is the study of the relationship between living organisms and between organisms and their environments. So broadly, what does that mean? So if we kind of take a step back and look at the fact that Earth has various systems that will interact, these various systems can be organized based on their location. So we do have the biosphere, which is where we'll start, which is where all living things are found. Next, we have the atmosphere, which is where all gases in the air are found. We now have the lithosphere, which is where all the rocks are found, and the hydrosphere, where all the water is found. Each of these systems is closely linked with the other, as demonstrated in the picture. So elements of the hydrosphere will cycle between the atmosphere and the lithosphere, back to the hydrosphere again. As we start to talk about the biosphere and these different areas, this will start to define what our ecosystem is. And then from our ecosystem, we'll talk about kind of the different levels of organization. So we'll first start with what is an ecosystem. So an ecosystem consists of a community of organisms together with the abiotic factors that surround and affect it. And by abiotic factors, we'll talk about this later, but we are talking about those non-living factors that are found within the environment. From there, within our ecosystems, we do have communities. So communities consist of all the organisms or all the populations that interact in that given area. And when we talk about interactions, interacting can mean a variety of things. So we can have one population feeding on another, one population that provides vital substances to another, one population providing protection for another, or one species providing a habitat for another. So for example, a tree providing a home for a particular species of bird. And then within our communities, those are made up of different populations. Those populations are basically groups of individuals of the same species that live in the same geographical area at the same time. There are a few more definitions that are good to know as we talk about ecosystems. So a habitat is the environment in which a species normally lives or the location of a living organism. The niche of an organism is the relational position of a species or population in its ecosystem. Our ecosystems can be organized into different levels based on what we are talking about. So using those terms that we've talked about, we can have a look at how these terms are related to each other. So we'll start first with the biosphere. As we mentioned, is the part of the Earth that contains all the ecosystems. This is where all the living things are found. Within our biosphere, those are made up of different ecosystems, and so that ecosystem is basically the community found within it and its non-living surroundings. Now those non-living surroundings, remember, are those abiotic factors. We can also have our communities. So within our ecosystems, we have our communities, which are populations that live together within that defined area. So in our ecosystem, if we take a step back, if we look at the populations and the non-living surroundings, in this particular example, it would involve things like the hawk, the snake, the bison, the prairie dog, the grass, the water or the stream, the rocks, and the air. The stream, the rocks, and the air are what make up those abiotic factors. The community then are the populations that live in the defined area. So those are things that are not, those are basically the living components of our ecosystem. So in this particular example, it is like the hawk, the snake, the bison, the prairie dog, and the grass. And then within our community, as we mentioned, we have those populations. And when we talk about population, we're talking about a group of organisms of one type that live in the same area. So in this case, it would just specifically be our bison or our bison herd. So together, this makes up the different levels that we have in our ecosystem. And we'll start to define how they interact with each other. So those different communities within our population now will have different feeding methods, and different feeding methods will exist within each ecosystem. But largely, there should be both autotrophs and heterotrophs. So we'll go through these terms in terms of feeding methods through which organisms obtain nutrients. So the first method of feeding is basically the autotrophs. These are organisms or species that are able to photosynthesize or trap solar energy and use this to fix carbon into organic compounds. The alternative term, or the term that they're commonly known as, are producers. They're able to produce their own energy. We also have heterotrophs, which consume organisms as a source of energy. So they can't make their own energy, they have to consume other things to get their energy. So they are generally referred to as consumers. Other types of heterotrophs that we can have that have to obtain their energy from other things include things like detritivores, which can be further classified into saprophytes and decomposers. And we'll go through specifically what those terms mean and how they obtain their nutrients. We can also look at how these methods of feedings can be classified and subdivided, and how they relate to each other. So ultimately, our feeding methods can be classified into two categories. So into autotrophy, or the autotrophs, or the heterotrophs. So the organisms which derive their energy from other living organisms. The autotrophs can be further subclassified into photoautotrophy or chemoautotrophy. So photoautotrophs produce photosynthesis. These are the green plants, the algae, the phytoplankton. And then whereas chemoautotrophy are organisms that derive their energy from deep sea thermal vents. So these tend to be chemosynthetic bacteria. In the heterotrophs, they can be further classified into consumers and the decomposers. The consumers can be further classified into primary and secondary and tertiary consumers. So in the next slide, we'll talk about that kind of further subdivision of our consumers. The decomposers can be further classified into detritivores and saprotrophs. The detritivores basically ingest dead or non-living organic matter and then digest, where the saprotrophs will basically release enzymes onto that non-living organic matter, which will digest it, and then they ingest that decomposed, further decomposed material. So our consumers can be further subdivided into basically where they derive their energy from. So a primary consumer is an organism that will derive its energy from consuming producers. A secondary consumer derives its energy from consuming primary consumers. And then you get a tertiary consumer, which will basically get its energy from secondary consumers. Usually we don't go beyond the tertiary consumer, and we'll talk about that in later videos. With our decomposers, as we mentioned, we can break these down into detritivores and saprotrophs. So detritivores basically ingest dead organic matter internally. So, for example, an earthworm ingests dead matter into their guts and then absorbs the nutrients there. Saprotrophs generally will secrete digestive enzymes externally into dead organic matter and then absorb the products of this digestion. So they don't take things internally, they secrete their enzymes onto that non-living organic matter, let the enzymes do their thing, and then absorb the breakdown products of that. So many saprotrophs are bacteria and fungi, but they are both types of decomposers. So with decomposers, they do play a role, with a very important role within our ecosystems. So decomposers do recycle nutrients so that they are available to other organisms that are not locked inside the bodies or waste products of organisms within the ecosystem. So we'll talk later on as well in a different video about nutrient cycling as well. So decomposers will also play a major role in the formation of soil. The rich layer of black soil that's referred to as humus is made up of organic debris and nutrients released by decomposers. So in this way, they do play an important role in cycling nutrients through an ecosystem. So that's it for this video. The next step now is to complete the Google form. This Google form can be found on the Google slideshow.